You know that feeling when your home just doesn't look as good as it should, but tackling a painting project feels like a headache? Between the mess, the time, and the worrying about the results, it's easy to put it off. That's why homeowners trust Hyler Painting. Their proven 7-step process keeps everything clean, organized, and stress-free. And it's backed by a 5-year warranty. Their mission is simple: to create raving fans. Get your free estimate today at hylerpainting.com. Everything feels more expensive right now, but one of Philly's best resources is still completely free. With a free library of Philadelphia card, you get access to thousands of programs, events, and digital resources for all ages, including ebooks, audiobooks, learning languages, genealogy, and news. Don't worry, they don't have those fees if you return your materials late. Sign up today, freelibrary.org/card, and see what's waiting for you. The school district is broke, and the mayor has a controversial plan to solve the problem. Meanwhile, the Center City bike lane saga continues, and what's going to happen with the anti-ice bills on the mayor's desk? Our political contributor, Lauren Vidas, is here to give us a roundup of what's going on in City Hall. It's Wednesday, April 29th. I'm Trenae Nuri, and we're talking politics. Hey, Lauren.
Hey, how's it going?
Good, but we got a lot to talk about. Lauren, why is the school district so broke? And why is it coming to the mayor and the city to close this deficit? Isn't the state of Pennsylvania under judicial order to give us this money that our schools need?
Yeah, so it's obviously with everything involving funding and public education, it's a little complicated. The school district has about a $4.6 billion budget, right? And about half of that budget comes from the state and half of it comes from the city. Now, the reason the school district is running this deficit is a couple of reasons. Number one, they received a lot of federal funding from both previous administrations as well as during the pandemic, and those funds have run out or been severely scaled back. So the amount of federal funding has dropped considerably in the last few years. The second element, which is the state funding, which makes up, I would say, also like half of the budget. There was a lawsuit a couple years ago, if folks remember, where a bunch of parents sued to say, hey, the state's funding formula, meaning how the states divvies out money to the different counties and different schools, is unfair. Wealthier counties, wealthier schools are getting a disproportionate amount of resources. Poorer school districts are suffering for that. The Commonwealth Court declared that the funding formula that the state used was unconstitutional and sent the legislature back to the drawing board to come up with a new funding formula. So while the state has increased some funding over the last couple of years to try to meet that challenge, they haven't redone this funding formula as the courts have required. So there's a bit of a lag in what we're seeing between the Commonwealth Court decision and the dollars actually flowing to the school districts. And then the last piece is something that I'm sure parents listening to this podcast are familiar with, which is just the age of the district buildings and infrastructure. There's been a lot of population changes over the last 50 years. So like Northeast Philadelphia has grown considerably. Schools up there are bursting at the seams, while some schools in the Southwest and Northwest have far below the amount of kids that they once had. And so the school district's allocation of resources is somewhat inefficient right now. They're paying a lot of maintenance expenses to keep these buildings open. They have to send money to charter schools under state law for charter students. So they're sort of seeing the crunch at the local level as well. And so that is despite having a pretty good record of money management. This is not, everybody thinks, oh, it's waste, it's all that. No, the school district has been pretty fiscally responsible. They're just kind of suffering from this like three-headed monster that has ballooned their deficit to about $300 million.
And then that's when people go, well, why do we have to pay for it through this proposal that Mayor Parker came up with? First, it was a 20-cent tax on every rideshare ride. Now it's bumped up to $1. Why the increase? Because last week, council was fired up about this, Some saying, it was going to be hard to explain yet another tax to our neighbors. So why did it increase? And what is City Council's take on this?
Yeah, I think that's where the mayor has faced the most backlash. Not that she's necessarily proposing new revenue for the school district, but in her budget address, as you noted, she proposed this 20-cent per ride tax that would go to support the school district. And that's a pretty, modest amount as the initial proposal. But there was a bit of delay in the school district kind of revealing the total amount of their deficit. And I think once that number came out and it was $300 million, the mayor and her team realized that 20-cent probably was not going to move the needle. And so they upped it to $1. Now, keep in mind, the school district is its own sort of entity. It has its own chief financial officer. It has its own leadership. It has its own budget office. And so while it's important for the communication between the school district, the mayor, and city council to be open and free-flowing, a lot of times you don't have that totally transparent conversation. And so I think that's where council was frustrated as well. Is like, hey, why do you guys wait to the last minute every year to tell us that we're in this deficit? We need to be working together because you always come to us and we always deliver. So let's all get on the same page earlier.
And Uber says this is a double tax because the PPA, Philadelphia Parking Authority, already taxes rideshare trips.
Yeah, so the rideshare folks are saying the city doesn't have the authority to tax us because the state already taxes us. And what the Mayor Parker has kind of pointed to is the soda tax, saying like, hey, we heard that argument with the soda tax. We got taken to court and if we won. We think this is the same scenario, that we do have the authority to levy this additional tax on you to support the schools.
I think it's also important to add that PPA also puts money into the district as well.
Yeah, correct. So anytime you get a parking ticket, I just mentally tell myself it's a contribution to our schools, and that somehow makes it a little bit better.
So are we going to get this fee? Will council pass it? Because we were just trying to calculate this as a team on CityCast Philly on last Friday's show, and I took about 1,000 trips on Uber alone. That's $1,000 extra out of my pocket. I don't know if I can afford this.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the argument that council is making for the folks who aren't really happy with the tax, saying like, people are crunched enough, right? Inflation is out of control. The cost of everything has gone up. The cost of housing has gone up. We can't be piling on to people with like these additional fees. On the other hand, I think what the administration and the mayor is saying is like, Uber for a lot of people is a luxury, right? Like you could walk, you could take SEPTA, barring, sort of like elderly folks or people who have physical limitations, folks have options and people often decide to pick rideshare over SEPTA, which is another major funding crisis. So I think what the mayor is saying is like, this is not necessarily a luxury item, but it's kind of close to it, right? And that people can afford this one extra dollar to such an important cause in terms of keeping the city's schools open and appropriately funded.
It cost me about 25, like on a very good day, there's like no surge, $25 to get downtown in a ride share. That's one way. And then maybe like 35 to get to the airport. Again, one way.
Yeah. And if the mayor has her way, it will be $26 and $36. And I think she would say that's a small price to pay for ensuring that our kids have access to adequate resources at schools. So this is the debate. City Council has taken it up. I think the dollar certainly makes it a heavier lift, right? It's a lot easier to kind of sell 20 cents. You probably don't even notice that little fee on the thing, but $1, that's a real number, right? And so I think this is where you have City Council and the mayor kind of butting heads. And I think the mayor's position is like, hey, you don't like the rideshare tax, that's fine. Come up with some new revenue because I'm not leaving these folks hanging in a $300 million deficit. And, council is sort of very reluctant, again, because of, the way the economy is, the way that working folks are really struggling right now to raise any revenue. Our other options are, real estate, wage and business taxes, and they've been kind of working to scale those down and provide more protection. So it's really not an easy or simple solution to this larger fundings deficit. And honestly, until the state gets its act together and provides this sort of necessary funding, we're going to be having this conversation every budget.
That's how I feel. I feel like we just launch into like financial crisis to another financial crisis to another financial crisis. And it's becoming like this bit of like boy who cried wolf, because we were freaking out last year about SEPTA cuts. The governor came through with some money at the last minute. You're telling me now, like, the district came to council kind of last minute. So who's to say that all this won't happen again? And can Governor Josh Shapiro find some cash from the state to send over to the district?
Yeah, I think that remains to be seen. I know that education is, very important to the governor, and he has come through in the past with additional resources for the district. But, let's be clear, these problems and these sort of lurching from crisis to crisis are because of the systemic failures that have been in place for years. The crisis with SEPTA is not a crisis made last year. It's a crisis made 10, 15 years ago when we failed to raise the gas tax to fund public transportation. The school district issue, that's not a crisis made this year. That's a crisis that's been in the making for the last 2 decades because of a poor funding formula, right? So it feels like everything's on fire, but the sparks that started these things happened years ago. And until we, do some meaningful and reform to these funding systems, we will be having these conversations every year. And frankly, it's an election year in Harrisburg. I don't see any new revenue, new taxes, new money coming into the budget. They generally stay away from tax increases during an election year. So it may have to wait till next year before we get a final answer on what that looks like.
So basically what I hear you saying that like none of this feels like none of these approaches have been sustainable, and folks at the table who know the ins and outs of this, they know how to negotiate. And yet we come to this place where we're kind of like at odds with one another. And if you ever like read the comment section on a TikTok or an IG post, and you will see like how like Philly does not hold back their feelings and people are pissed. And how do we break this cycle?
When you talked about SEPTA, a boy who cried wolf, SEPTA is borrowing from its capital budget to pay
Right.
for operating costs, right? So we are just kicking this can. So when trains start breaking down and we don't have the money to fix them because we've been using that money to pay operators, like this is a snowball rolling down a hill, getting bigger. Every year we decide that we're not going to tackle these sort of basic issues. And I think part of it is just the dynamic in Harrisburg is very difficult, where we have to be okay generating consistent revenue and saying, okay, we need to be the adults in the room. We need to raise the gas tax. We need to put a tax in place that's going to fund infrastructure, not just public transit, but the bridges, roads, like the infrastructure statewide. It feels like it's a Philadelphia issue because it's SEPTA and things like that. But every county has been starved of funding for years because we haven't made the investments into the Commonwealth. And I think until the political dynamic changes a little bit, particularly the current political culture, where it's about tax cuts for billionaires and like everybody else can good luck, I don't think we're going to see those systemic fixes. And people are going to have to be willing to compromise, right? And like the political dynamic right now is just compromise is a bad word, and we just can't continue. We're not going to solve any problems if that continues to be the case.
All right, we've got more after the break. Also, Lauren, it's important to add that tomorrow we're expected to hear from the school board on whether they're going to okay the plan to close 17 schools and modernize 169 school buildings all over the district. Can you explain how all this is wrapped up in the district's $3 billion plan?
The school board is considering they don't call it the closure plan, but they're essentially what they're trying to do is they're trying to look at which school buildings are underused by students, underutilized, meaning that they just don't have enough students in the schools to justify keeping them open, which buildings are too old and too unhealthy to put money into remediating, and looking at those population changes I mentioned, right? And so on one hand, you have the school district saying like, hey, we are taking concrete steps to try to be fiscally responsible when it comes to our budget, our capital budget, how we're allocating resources. So we need to do this in order to kind of rebalance the district and the distribution of students. On the other hand, neighborhood schools are deeply, deeply personal to folks, right? They tried to close my neighborhood catchment school, I want to say in 2010, and the neighbors came out in force. We were able to actually convince the school district that it was a bad idea. We showed them, hey, this neighborhood's growing in population. People want public school as an option. So again, there's that tension between the district trying to do what they see as the fiscally responsible thing, but then getting a lot of pushback from folks saying, like, yeah, you can't close my school. And so they're kind of stuck in this quagmire of how do we limit this deficit while at the same time kind of respecting the needs and desires of parents throughout the district. And it's, as I said at the top of this, like, it's complicated. If we fixed all the easy problems in Philadelphia, right? If this problem were easy, we would have fixed it by now. And things are just incredibly complicated and interconnected. And education is an emotional topic for people.
Yes. And it just feels heavy when the burden keeps coming to our front doors, to our porches. Another controversial topic in Philly. So there's still this lawsuit pending over installing protected bike lanes through Center City on Pine and Spruce Streets. But in the meantime, City Council is trying to create loading zones so that delivery trucks would be able to pull over at a designated spot instead of stopping in a bike lane, which causes that lane to be blocked. Are these new loading zones a way of setting us up for protected bike lanes in Center City?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest reasons we don't have protected bike lanes, especially on blocks like Pine or Spruce, where it used to be two traffic lanes and now it's down to one traffic, one bike,
Hmm.
and one parking lane, is people say, hey, I have to be able to like stop and unload my groceries, right?
Right.
If you put up a barrier, I'm going to be stopped in the middle of the street and I'm going to block traffic. And the city said, okay, well, you know what, that makes sense. So we're going to start adding all of these loading zones throughout the city. A lot of them are smart loading zones, meaning people you pull in, you pay 10 cents a minute. It does this so that people don't sit there for hours. It's automatic ticketing, things like that. And the idea is to give people a safe place to pull over to do what they need to do in that 5-10 minute period and then go find a legal parking spot somewhere else. So I think once the city has the system in place, I think it eliminates one of the biggest arguments about why we shouldn't have protected bike lanes in the city. So I do see it as kind of the precursor to eventually getting concrete barriers to protect the bike lanes.
Okay, so then there's this other bill to create designated ride share drop off and pickup spots throughout Center City. But Lauren, if I wear heels and I have to walk 2 blocks and I'm starting to sweat before like an outing, like what? I don't know if I'm like into this one.
Yeah, I think this one's going to be a little bit tougher to enforce, right? Because drivers stop wherever they want to stop and they will drop you off wherever they tell you to drop them off. So, I do think the city is trying to look at options to what it's about improving traffic flow, right? It's about making sure that we're not getting down to one lane because you've got people double parked running into a restaurant to pick up food, things like that. And increasing traffic flow, I'm sure, is something that we would all benefit from, right? Not getting stuck in less traffic. So I think the city is, especially in the Center City area where, there's folks getting dropped off all the time. They're trying to create some structure and some systems in place to try to minimize the disruptiveness of this sort of new economy that we're all living in.
Mm. The other big thing that we got to talk about recently went down in city council last week was the ICE out legislation, which passed by an overwhelming majority. This is considered the toughest local legislation to push back against ICE in the country. So we're talking about banning law enforcement agents from wearing masks, covering their face, keeping ICE off of city-owned property, affirming our status as a sanctuary city. Would this do anything, Lauren? Would our immigrant neighbors in Philly be protected from deportation today than they were before this all passed?
I mean, I think the provisions in place about the city's cooperation with immigrations and custom enforcement will protect some folks from having their status shared and things like that. I'm less hopeful about the provisions about ICE not wearing masks and showing badges because these folks have demonstrated an unwillingness to kind of follow police standards, law enforcement standards and norms before. I'm not sure, but certainly I think it's as much about what will the legislation effectively do and practically do, as well as the message that the city of Philadelphia is sending not only to the federal government in terms of, our unwillingness to tolerate this behavior in the city of Philadelphia, but it's sending an important message to our immigrant population that the city of Philadelphia has your back and we will work to protect you to ensure that you're not terrorized, that you feel safe to come forward if you've been a victim of a crime to report this crime without being worried about your status being shared with ICE. So, I think there's a lot of folks that look at this and they say, oh, this is lawlessness, you're allowing folks who are undocumented to kind of get away with it. But I think the other side of that is that this is also about law enforcement. This is about ensuring that victims of crimes are able to come forward to get the actual criminals off the street and that they are protected in doing so. So I think it's a very important piece of legislation. It's a package of legislation, 6 or 7 bills. It was sponsored by council members Rue Landau and Kendra Brooks, who I know worked very closely with advocates from the community as well as the law department and the police department and everybody kind of involved. So so now it heads to the mayor's desk.
Right. I was just going to say that because all eyes are on Mayor Parker now, who's been reluctant to take on the Trump administration. So will she sign this?
If I were a betting woman, I'm guessing she will sign the bill. There's sort of 3 options she has. She can sign the bill and it becomes law. She can do nothing, leave it unsigned, and it will become law automatically in 10 days. Or she could veto it. She's absolutely not going to veto the bill. It's got a supermajority to pass. They could overturn her veto. Or she could kind of sign some, decide not to sign others. I think it really depends on what the law department advises her. Politically, I don't think she has much to gain by letting them just become law automatically. But I think by signing them, she's sending, again, it's about as much the message as it is the practical effect of her actions.
Okay, we got all of this. We have the schools, we have ICE. There are 2 other things that dominated city council's agenda over the last 2 years that I haven't heard anything in months about. And can you give us some updates on 2? First, the mayor's home initiative to build and preserve thousands of units of housing in the city. Where is council on all of this?
So if you recall, home last year was all about getting the bonds and the funding in place. And I think right now what you're seeing is that money is slowly kind of getting out the door. So right now they're in the what I would call the implementation phase, right? So council has to approve the upcoming year's home budget, basically how are they going to spend these bond proceeds, things like that. So things are moving. I think the fact that we haven't heard a ton about it in this budget cycle, there's been a couple of bills that the mayor has sent over to council related to zoning and legislation designed to kind of promote transit-oriented communities. But for the most part, I think things are moving relatively smoothly. And again, anytime, government has to borrow money and get it out on the street, you're going to see a bit of a delay. So I think the mayor's excited to kind of see the fruits of the labor of the last 2 years of work between her and council to get this money borrowed and dispatched into communities.
And the new 76ers arena down in South Philly, it still needs council's approval, right? And are there any upcoming hearings people should be aware of?
No, I think they are. So the 76ers and Flyers announced that they're going to build on the site of the old Spectrum. So that was the stadium prior to the Wells Fargo Center. I joke this is Philadelphia's version of crop rotation. We build a stadium, we use it, we tear it down, we tailgate on it for 30 years, and then we plan a new stadium right on top. So I think the big component of that, the Sixers, the Comcast, Spectacor, and the Sixers have a lot on their plate, right? So they have this new stadium design.
And they're also going to introduce the WNBA expansion team.
WNBA expansion team, which is very exciting. They promise mixed-use development, so it's not just going to be, we're just going to plop a stadium on the parking lot and, they're planning housing, restaurants, things like that to try to make this more of a destination before and after the game. And then lastly, if you remember during the Market Street debate about the arena, there was a lot of land purchase. So they promised to put money into Market East as well. So from a development standpoint, there are a lot of moving parts with this. I think think we'll see the priority is going to be the new arena. My guess is that Market East will probably come second, and then we'll see this mixed-use development hopefully in the future, because, that location can be a huge asset to having a new project that can attract new residents, new businesses, and just like new life to what is otherwise just a sea of parking.
Lauren Vidas, thank you so much for just catching me up with what the heck is going on in City Council.
Thank you so much for having me.
That's all for today here on CityCast Philly. If you enjoyed this episode about local politics, share this with a friend. Also rate the show, leave us a review, and hit that subscribe button. Be sure to sign up for our morning newsletter to learn more about what else Philly's talking about. And don't forget, you can support the show and get great perks by becoming a CityCast Philly neighbor at membership.citycast.fm. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Bye.